Youth out-migration. It's something that we've been talking about in our region for my whole life, and now that I'm living in Toronto, I'm part of the problem. My wife and I recently have a youth of our own whose grandparents, cousins, and all but one of his aunts and uncles live here in Thunder Bay. So we've been thinking a lot lately about what kind of community we'd like to come back to if we think about where we want to raise our family. Now, for another audience, I'd spend some time bragging about the landscape. I'd talk about that stretch of highway just west of Rossport where you come through the rock cut and around the corner and you see Superior just stretched out in front of you like an IMAX masterpiece. Or I'd talk about Panzerotti at Caesar's Place, or prime rib at the Prospector, or I'd even risk antagonizing my Finnish relatives by arguing for the pancakes at the Scan over those at the Hoito. But here in the Northwest, I don't have to preach to the choir. You guys already know about that stuff. You know what makes our region so special. You know about the warm people and how the 11 p.m. July sunsets compensate for the February blizzards. So what I do want to talk about today is how the theme of reinvention for this conference really applies to our region. And I hope that while I'm using examples grounded in our local experiences, it's relevant to other communities facing similar challenges. Why reinvention? Well, one answer might be because our community is dying. That's certainly true literally. The number of deaths in Northwestern Ontario has outpaced the number of births for some time now. And Stats Canada says that's going to continue to be true. In addition, lots of the young people who are being born here are leaving for school and work, and many of them aren't coming back. Youth out-migration has slowed from its peak of 15.4% in the 5-year period from 1996 to 2001, but it's still significant. It was at negative 7.6% from 2005 to 2010. Now, this isn't new. Last time Northern Ontario had a net increase in population in a 5-year period was between 86 and 91. Since then, there's been a steady decline of between 1% and 4% in each subsequent 5-year period. Now, of course, there's a chicken and egg relationship between jobs and out-migration. Young people can't stay because the jobs aren't here. And one of the reasons the jobs aren't here is because the young people are leaving. Simple math. A declining population means the economy shrinks with less customers, less entrepreneurs, less innovators, less producers. But there have been some creative attempts to slow and reverse this decline. The most compelling argument to me and to many for the creation of the new law school and the med school were the stats that suggest that when you train people in northern communities, a large number of them will stay there. I also love the idea of the Christmas job fair for expatriates that is held over the holidays to attract the students and people who are living away from Thunder Bay, who are home visiting their families. We need to build on great ideas like this. Let me be clear. A community without young people is a community without a future. The fastest growing demographic in the coming years in Northwestern Ontario is people over the retirement age. Well, that's not quite true. There is one other demographic that's growing just as fast, and that's Aboriginal youth. The 2006 census says that in Northwestern Ontario, 20% of the population is Aboriginal. It's even more interesting when you break it down by age cohort. In the 15 to 29 age group, 26% of the population is Aboriginal. In the 0 to 14 group, it's 34%. That's right, more than a third of the young people in Northwestern Ontario are Aboriginal. It's interesting because, for example, we don't see that reflected in this room. Now, what's even more interesting is that our track record of helping First Nations youth is just terrible. I don't have to talk to you about treaties and residential schools and the challenges of life on reserve. You can just look at the numbers. In Northern Ontario, 55% of Aboriginal population completed high school versus 71% of the non-Aboriginal population. 5% of the First Nations population completed a BA or higher versus 16% of the non-Aboriginal population just in the north. So there's no surprise that the average employment income shows a huge disparity. About $24,000 a year average income for First Nations workers versus over $60,000 annually for non-First Nations workers, according again to 2006 census data. And the bad news keeps coming. The Aboriginal labor force participation rate of 59% lags behind the non-Aboriginal participation rate of 67%. The unemployment rate is about double, 16% for First Nations versus 8.4% for non-First Nations. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the health and the social issues, the higher burden of chronic diseases, the life expectancy that's 5 to 8 years lower on average, the higher infant mortality, the cost of living in remote communities where basic food items like a carton of milk can cost $13. All of that's prelude to this point. We cannot talk about the young people of our community, the future of our community, without acknowledging that huge and growing numbers of those young people are First Nations youth. And if they don't succeed economically, socially, neither can our region, our city, our families. Now, I'm going to make a bit of a sharp turn here, because I know, having talked about the problems, I'm supposed to offer solutions. I'm supposed to talk about repealing the Indian Act, or the Kelowna Accord, or self-government, or resource revenue sharing, or having the provinces deliver education on reserve. But I won't do it. I'm not willing anymore to be the latest in a long line of well-intentioned white guys with solutions that stretches back about 400 years. Because whether we call it civilizing, converting, or assimilating, our track record is undistinguished. So instead, I'm going to talk about the things that I know make sense for our community based on my experiences. And I won't pretend that I can speak for First Nations communities that I'm not a part of. I would like nothing more than to hear an Aboriginal voice. In fact, a chorus of voices challenging my assumptions, pointing out flaws in my arguments. If we're to be good neighbors and partners, dialogue is essential. Now, if you're thinking in terms of us and them with regards to First Nations youth, even if you're more cynical than I am about the necessity, the value, and the prospects of us working better together, the numbers say you have a vested interest in making this work. Even if you have no interest in mentoring a student from Dennis Franklin Cromarty High School or working with the Pick River First Nation on their next hydro development, if you have kids or plan to, remember this: if we want our non-First Nations youth to stay here or to come back, we need to demonstrate that the racial dynamics in our region are changing. If you doubt me on this, watch the look on the faces of young people in a room when a friend of your uncle starts talking about those natives. Young people are more progressive than old people and more optimistic. They're way ahead of us, not just on human rights issues like gay marriage, but on common sense issues like drunk driving. If we want our young people to stay in our community instead of moving to larger centers with better records of multicultural cooperation, we need to demonstrate to them that we share their values and that we're just as embarrassed of the routine racism in our community today as our parents now are of the widespread drunk driving they grew up with in the 70s, and just as determined to change it. Fundamentally, as a parent, isn't that what makes youth outmigration so scary? The possibility that it isn't just a trend, but a judgment? That your kids are moving away, and it's always going to be your fault, because if you'd done a better job building a community for them to be proud of, to work in, to feel part of, they either wouldn't have left or would at least come back more often so you could see your grandkids. My central argument is this: if we don't want our region to die slowly, we need to build a better community with and for our young people. Thunder Bay can't become a city of old white people who don't work because they're retired and young First Nations people who aren't working because our school system and social supports have failed them. And make no mistake, from a systemic perspective, that's exactly what happens and continues. So if you think I'm setting up a straw man, consider this. In Northern Ontario, the population of core working-age people between 25 and 54 is projected to decline by 18%, while the population 65 and over will increase by 80% in the next 20 years. The future workforce of our region is made up in large numbers of non-First Nations people, many of whom leave, and First Nations youth who are currently not being given the tools they need to succeed. That is the crux of our need for reinvention. So what can we do together? What does it mean to build with and for youth? There's a number of things we can do to improve our community, but there's three things that I want to focus on. ironically, after the video that preceded me. One of them is education and training. The other is research, and the third is cross-cultural communication. In terms of educational attainment, in that same 25 to 64 age group we were talking about earlier, in the northern population, we're at or near the Ontario average for high school and college diplomas. We're above the Ontario average for apprenticeships and trades, but we're behind in two key areas. 15.4% in Northwestern Ontario have BAs or higher versus 26% province-wide. 20.3% of Northwestern Ontario residents have less than a grade 11 education versus 13.6% in the Ontario population, according to 2006 census numbers. For First Nation youth, the data is even less encouraging. But there's good news. These are fixable problems. There's no reason that more youth can't finish high school, get a post-secondary education, whether that's an apprenticeship or college or university. There's no reason we can't have the best trained, most highly skilled, highly educated workforce in Ontario. And that would be no small feat, given that Ontario was recently rated by the OECD as having one of the top 5 education systems in the world. We have to want it, though. We have to make it a priority. Smarter people than me can tell you about programs proven to help keep kids in school. Part of it, it seems to me, though, is the values that we have as a community. Are we willing to volunteer to make our schools better by helping with sports and plays and clubs, even if we don't have kids in those schools? Are we willing to create partnerships between educators and the community through things like co-op programs? When I was at St. Pat's, I had a great co-op program. I worked at the law firm of Atwood Shaw Labine and got some great work experience and made some friendships that I have to this day. But what I found really interesting is that the other university-bound kids in the advanced stream were not encouraged to do co-ops. It was just the general kids who were doing co-ops in hair salons and trucking businesses and childcare facilities. And they all got great experiences. But why don't we want more of our young people to work in businesses and institutions and build those bridges between the communities? I think that would be an incredibly valuable thing, not just in high school, but for colleges and universities as well. Now, co-ops, of course, are just one way we can partner with our educators. Another is research. From a public policy perspective, and this goes back to kind of what I do for my day job, there's two real proven government interventions in the economy. The first is infrastructure spending, particularly as stimulus during a recession. And the second is investment in research and development. So our former mayor, Lynn Peterson, had a really neat focus on trying to make Thunder Bay a biomedical hub. And we need to keep leveraging the great work that's happening here at Lakehead, across the street at the hospital, at the Cancer Center, at the RegenMed Tissue Bank, the DNA labs. We need to look at the great work that the Center for Research and Innovation in the Bioeconomy is doing, researching new technologies that could transform the future of the forest sector. And we need to look at the supply and services industry that's going to spring up here as we become the natural jumping off point for the Ring of Fire. And as we commercialize and export the best practices that we as Northerners already have in terms of resource stewardship and natural resource management, that's a tremendous opportunity for our region. Now, there's always going to be students who leave to get specialized education, and that's fine. We should encourage them and let them know they're always welcome back. But if we can find opportunities to keep some of our best and brightest here, we all benefit. The final piece I'm going to talk to you about is about cross-cultural communication. As I said, the First Nations population is the fastest growing part of our population here in the Northwest. We need to embrace that. A man I admire very much is fond of saying that none of us is as strong as all of us. We need to close the educational attainment gap between First Nations and the non-Aboriginal population at the same time as we work to close the gap between Northern Ontario and Southern Ontario. To do that, we have to talk to each other, to listen to each other, and to work together. It's not just about education and jobs, though. I think a huge part of it is expectations. Let me use an imperfect analogy. A few short generations ago, women didn't have prominent social roles outside the home. They weren't in politics, didn't vote. How did that change? It wasn't men who initially crusaded on behalf of women, but once the movement got going, it needed male support. Women who didn't have the right to vote until 1928 and didn't enter the workforce in large numbers until World War II still today face higher rates of poverty, discrimination, routine condescension, and hypocritical demands in public life, but damn it, we're not done yet. One thing that has changed, though, is expectations. Thunder Bay has seen women mayors, hospital CEOs, college presidents, Olympic gold medalists, provincial party leaders, and we expect more in the future. Why do so many of us give up before seeing a similar future for our First Nations population? Why shouldn't it be unremarkable for our kids that the best hockey players in their class, the brightest students in their schools, the kids whose parents make the best snacks at soccer practices, that those kids be from Fort William First Nation and Martin Falls and Grassy? That's the future we need to build together. I know I'm not the only son or daughter of the Northwest who lives at a town and thinks about raising a family in Thunder Bay. The schools, the people, the family we have here, the quality of life that's so different from Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, Minneapolis. We have so many advantages and we have to build on them. Communities can't afford to write off their young people. That's as true in Northwestern Ontario as it is in Iran, in Tunisia, or in Egypt. And that's why the solutions that I'm talking about are not exclusive to our region. We need to listen to our young people, to be responsive to their priorities. Now, I'm still just barely able to make a claim to youth myself. And I want the real young people in the audience, the ones who can laugh at a guy claiming to represent them despite not having a Facebook or a Twitter account or having read Harry Potter or The Hunger Games. I want to challenge you to come up with your rebuttals, your refinements, and your expansions right now. We can have a drink later on, if you're old enough, or you can post your video or speak at the next TEDxThunderBay, because we need to hear from you. We need to help you, to lift you up and encourage you, because we need someone to visit us when we're old, someone to pay taxes to heat our retirement homes, and to do everything you can to make this place better for your kids, whether or not we're able to do the same for you. A better world is not inevitable. We've got to fight for it. If we want a society that reflects our values, we need to speak up, to get involved, and to make it happen. There's no magic. There's no shortcuts. It's about priorities, generosity, and hard work. Let's build a region we can be proud of, a region that values young people, education, research, communication, a region we can be proud to raise our kids in and bring them back to. Let's do it together, because nobody else will do it for us.